Okay, guys, today we're going to be talking about the heart. You're going to have a Google form to complete to answer some questions about what we talk about in this PowerPoint, and then you're also going to have an interactive notebook to complete. As I told you in the previous video that I did for Monday, all of your work will be due by Sunday, April the 19th at 11:55 p.m. So our heart is pretty amazing. It beats about 100,000 times every day, and during the course of the day, it pumps about 8,000 liters or 2,200 gallons of blood. Again, that doesn't mean you have that much blood in your body. It's pumping the same blood over and over and over again. Basically, our heart is a pump. Why do we need a heart? Well, our heart is responsible for pumping blood to all the cells of our body. Why do all the cells of our body need blood? Well, the cells of our body need oxygen and nutrients, and the blood carries the oxygen and nutrients. So the heart is kind of the pump behind the delivery system. The heart is responsible for pumping that blood to all the cells of your body so that the cells of your body can get the oxygen and nutrients that they need to keep them alive. There are 4 chambers to the heart. 2 of those chambers are going to send blood to your lungs to get oxygen. The other 2 will be sending blood to the rest of your body. There are valves inside the heart that make sure that the blood only flows in one direction. We don't want any backflow of the blood because that would be very inefficient. The younger you are, the faster your heart beats. A baby's heart beats about 90 times a minute. If you've ever known of anyone who had an ultrasound, when the woman is pregnant with the baby is so small and so young, its heart's beating around 140, 150 times a minute or more. But then once it's born, its heart's going to be beating around 90 times a minute. A 12-year-old has a heartbeat of about 78 times a minute, and an adult heart beat is around 70 times a minute. And again, this is average. It can be, it can vary a little bit, but basically, the more active you are, the more or faster that your heart will beat, because the more active you are, the more your cells are needing oxygen, especially those muscle cells, and so the heart has to beat faster to pump more blood containing oxygen to those cells to keep them producing the energy that they need to contract. Now, I'm not going to show this video, this crash course video on this lecture video, because it is copyrighted, and they may actually take my video down because it has a copyrighted video on it. But please take the time to go to the PowerPoint and watch this video, especially if there's anything that you're having trouble understanding. Okay, we want to look at some of the different blood vessels that we have in our body. The main blood vessels that we have are arteries, veins, and capillaries. Now, we do have smaller arteries called arterioles and smaller veins called venules. So what exactly are arteries? Arteries are also called efferent vessels. I'm not really worried about you knowing that word as much as I am expecting you to know what arteries do. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and I remember that by thinking artery away. They both start with A. So arteries always carry blood away from the heart. The largest artery in your body is called the aorta, and we're going to see that here pretty soon. It basically branches off the top of your heart, the superior portion of your heart, and then it arches, and there's some vessels that branch off that arch and go to your arms and your head, and then the rest of the aorta actually goes down behind the heart through the abdomen and then branches off into arteries that carry blood to the legs. Veins are also called afferent vessels, and the main thing I want you to be familiar with as far as veins go is that veins carry blood toward the heart. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood toward the heart. Again, venules are just smaller veins. Okay, and then our capillaries. Capillaries are very, very tiny vessels. They have such thin walls that it's easy for oxygen and nutrients as well as waste to diffuse into and out of the capillaries. So in our tissues, the capillaries are the vessels through which the oxygen and nutrients leave the blood and go into the tissues, and the carbon dioxide and the waste go from the tissues into the blood to be carried to the lungs to get rid of the CO2, and then to the kidneys to get rid of that liquid waste. So again, these are our arteries, these are our veins, and in the tissues we have these capillary beds. These are the very tiny, thin-walled vessels that allow the diffusion of oxygen and nutrients out of the blood into the tissues, and the diffusion of carbon dioxide and waste from the tissues into the blood. Some of these capillaries can be so small that only one red blood cell at a time will fit through them. This is a diagram that's just kind of showing you what's going on. Here is our blood vessel with the blood, and here are our tissues. As you can see by the arrows, things like oxygen as well as glucose and amino acids and other nutrients are coming out of the blood to feed the tissues, and then things like carbon dioxide and waste are coming from the tissues into the blood to be carried away to the lungs and to the kidneys. As we said earlier, the heart has 4 chambers. There are 2 smaller upper chambers called atria. Singular is atrium. And then there are 2 larger, more muscular, thicker walled chambers called ventricles, and those are the 2 lower chambers of the heart. Again, the atria are very small because they are basically just sending blood below to the ventricles. So the atria are on the top and they send blood to the ventricles. The ventricles, however, are much larger and stronger because they are responsible for pumping the blood further. One ventricle actually pumps blood to the lungs. The other ventricle pumps blood to the entire body. So those ventricles have to be much thicker, much stronger, much larger so that they can pump blood that further distance. Specifically, the right ventricle is pumping blood to the lungs. The left ventricle is pumping blood to your entire body. So which ventricle would you expect to be larger? If you said the left ventricle, I hope you said the left ventricle because that would be correct. The left ventricle, because it is pumping blood to the entire body, it is going to be the largest of the 4 chambers of the heart. In fact, it is so large that if one of the other chambers of the heart gets damaged, the left ventricle can kind of take over part of the function of that chamber. However, if something happens and the left ventricle is damaged, then that is going to be fatal because there's no other part of the heart that is big enough and strong enough to take over the job of that left ventricle. Okay, we do have walls dividing the left and right sides of the heart, and a wall that divides 2 spaces is called a septum, just like the little wall dividing the 2 nostrils of your nose. That's called your nasal septum. Well, we have an interatrial septum that's dividing the 2 atria, and then an interventricular septum that divides the 2 ventricles. We also have 2 valves inside of our heart. These valves are called the atrioventricular valves, or AV valves. We have a left atrioventricular and a right atrioventricular valve. The tricuspid valve is another name for the right atrioventricular valve. And then the bicuspid valve is another name for the left atrioventricular valve. Another name for that left AV valve besides bicuspid is the mitral valve. And I think you will find in a clinical setting that they call the right AV valve the tricuspid, and they call the left AV valve the mitral rather than the bicuspid. Both of these valves are reinforced by these structures inside the heart that kind of look like strings. We'll take a look at them here in a few minutes. They're called chordae tendineae. On one end, the chordae tendineae are attached to the valve. On the other end, the chordae tendineae are attached to what we call papillary muscles. Papillary muscles basically just help to contract. They are kind of there on the walls on the inside of the ventricles, and they help to contract to pull open that valve, and then they relax and allow that valve to shut. Again, what is so important about these valves? These valves are very important because they prevent the backflow of blood. They keep the blood moving in one direction, from the heart to the lungs to pick up oxygen, from the lungs back to the heart, and then from the heart to the body to carry that oxygen to all the cells of the body. So it's very important that that blood keep going in that one direction, picking up its oxygen, dropping off its carbon dioxide, and then going to the cells of the body to drop off the oxygen and pick up the carbon dioxide. If you had backflow, then your blood would not contain enough oxygen to keep all the cells of your body oxygenated. So these valves are very important. They open to allow the blood to move from the atria to the ventricles, and then they close to prevent the blood from going back up into the atria, because we don't want it back in the atria. Once it goes from the atria to the ventricles, then we want it to keep going out to the lungs into the body. We don't want it going back up into the atria again. This is another video that would be very good for you to go to the PowerPoint and watch. It is kind of showing you the different structures that we just talked about inside the heart. And there are also some videos on here that really are good to show you the blood flow through the heart that we'll be talking about. Okay, we're going to look at some external landmarks on the heart. There is a deep groove that separates the atria and the ventricles. It's called the coronary sulcus, and it is usually filled with large amounts of fat. We'll look at that in just a few minutes as well. We also want to look at the base and the apex. We're not going to worry about the borders. We're just going to skip those. But the base is, when you think of base, you normally think of the bottom of something, like the basement is the bottom of your house, the base of a table is the bottom of it. But for the heart, the base is actually the superior portion. It is the area where the large blood vessels, the large arteries and veins enter and leave the heart. And then the apex is not the upper portion, but the lower portion. It is the lower pointed tip of the heart. It kind of hangs free. So here we can see, here is the apex. Up here, this would be the base. This would be the coronary sulcus here. You can see that the yellow looking stuff there is fat. And remember, it is the groove that's separating the atria from the ventricles. You also can see a lot of the external portions of the heart. Here is the right atrium. Here's the left atrium. Again, you have to think if this heart were in your body, okay? So when we are looking at a picture of this, and this gets students confused a lot of the times, when you're looking at a picture of the heart, okay, it's opposite. So your left is that heart's right. Your right is that heart's left, okay, because this heart is in your chest. So you have to think of picking up the piece of paper and turning it around and putting it up to your chest. What would be the right and the left? So it's backward when you are facing it. So this is the right atrium, this is the left atrium, this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle. Now here, this left ventricle looks a little small and this right atrium looks a lot bigger. However, when we look at the inside of the heart, you're going to be able to see how much bigger and thicker the walls of this left atrium are. The reason the left atrium looks a lot smaller here is because in your chest, the heart is rotated so that the right side forms more the front or the anterior portion of the heart. So this heart is pictured here like it sits in our chest, so that the right side kind of forms a lot of the anterior portion, and the left ventricle is tilted a little bit more toward the posterior side. But in fact, the left ventricle is a lot larger. We also can see here, these are called the vena cava. This is the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. This is the aorta that I mentioned to you, the largest artery in your body. Again, this is called the ascending aorta. This is the aortic arch, and then the descending aorta goes down behind the heart and goes down toward the legs. Now here we can see some arteries branching off this aorta going to the head and the arms. And then, of course, the descending aorta would come down behind the heart and branch off and go to both legs. We also can see here pulmonary arteries here, and then pulmonary veins here are below the pulmonary arteries. We have right pulmonary arteries and veins, and we have left pulmonary arteries and veins. We call this big portion here, we call this the pulmonary trunk. So basically, your left and right pulmonary arteries branch off of the pulmonary trunk. The left pulmonary arteries are leading toward the left lung, and the right pulmonary arteries are leading toward the right lung. Again, those right pulmonary arteries are kind of going through this aortic arch here behind the superior vena cava and branching out over here to this right lung. And we will look at some internal structures of the heart here in just a few minutes as well. We also have what we call semilunar valves. These semilunar valves are valves that are located at the exits of the the exits of the ventricles. These occur between the ventricles and the arteries attached to those ventricles. The aortic semilunar valve lies between the left ventricle and the aorta, and then the pulmonary semilunar valve lies between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So basically, when blood leaves this right ventricle, it goes through this pulmonary semilunar valve and into the pulmonary arteries. And then when blood leaves the left ventricle, it goes through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta to be carried to your entire body. Another name for this aortic semilunar valve is just the aortic valve. Another name for the pulmonary semilunar valve is the pulmonic valve. The last thing we want to talk about before we look at blood flow through the heart is we want to look at the two circuits of circulation, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit includes all the vessels that carry blood to and from the lungs. So that's going to be like your pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins. The systemic circuit includes all the vessels that carry blood to and from the entire body. So again, that's going to include the vena cava, the aorta, and then all the vessels that branch off of those going to all the different parts of your body. So when we talk about the pulmonary circuit, I just like to think of lungs. Remember, pulmonary means lungs. And when we talk about the systemic circuit, I like to think of the whole body, the entire body. These are showing you some of the major arteries and veins in your body. I'm not going to be asking you to label this or anything like that. The main thing you're going to need to be familiar with is going to be that aorta and that superior and inferior vena cava. Now, if we had looked at the rabbits, we would have looked at the jugular vein, we would have looked at the femoral artery and vein, we would have looked at a few of those, but since we're not getting to dissect the rabbit, we don't get to look at those. Okay, here is another video that will be very good to help you understand how blood flows through the heart. Again, because this may be copyrighted, I'm not going to show this video during this lecture, but please go to the PowerPoint and watch these videos. They'll really help you. Okay, so looking at blood flow through the heart, I'm going to go ahead and go to the diagram that I have for you. So I start with the right atrium. Blood will go from the right atrium through the right AV valve or the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it will go through that pulmonic valve or pulmonary semilunar valve, into the pulmonary arteries and through the pulmonary arteries to the pulmonary circuit, which is going to be the lungs. In the lungs, it will pick up oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide for you to breathe out. And then it will leave the lungs and come back in through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood will go through the left AV valve, also called the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve, and into the left ventricle. Remember, this is the largest part of your heart. Blood leaves the left ventricle, goes through the aortic semilunar valve, or you can just call that the aortic valve, through the aorta to the entire body. Remember, in your body, in the tissues, the oxygen will be dropped off to the tissues to nourish them, and the carbon dioxide will be picked back up. Then this deoxygenated blood will come back to the heart through the vena cava, the superior and inferior vena cava, back to the right atrium, and the flow will happen all over again. They say it's more like a figure 8 because it goes from the heart to the lungs, to the heart to the body, and that's kind of what we have here. This is heart, lungs, heart, body, and then back to the heart again. So they call it more of a figure 8, but I found this diagram online and I thought, well, it's a good way to kind of show that it is kind of just a repeating cycle. This will come in very handy for you when you are doing your interactive notebook. This is another diagram kind of showing you how this is happening. Again, this diagram is not completely correct because it has it backward. Remember, this side is actually the right and this side is the left. But in any case, blood is coming in from the systemic circuit through the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium, from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, through the pulmonic valve out to the lungs, from the lungs back in through the pulmonary arteries into the left atrium, through the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, and then out the aortic valve through the aorta to the body. And again, this is the aorta here. Here's the aortic arch, and this is the aorta going to the body. Remember, you do also have some vessels branching off up here going to the head and the arms as well. Okay, here is another video that is going to show blood flow through the heart. Again, go to the PowerPoint and watch that video if you're having trouble with the blood flow through the heart. Okay, here are internal structures of the heart. We can still see our superior and inferior vena cava. We can still see our right pulmonary arteries and right pulmonary veins. We can still see our pulmonary trunk, our left pulmonary arteries and veins. We can still see our aorta. What we want to focus on in this diagram are the internal structures. Again, we can still see the right atrium and the left atrium. We can see the right ventricle and the left ventricle. What else we can see here? We can see this tricuspid valve. And then over here we can see the bicuspid valve. Here we can see that pulmonic valve. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve or pulmonic valve. And here you can barely see it, but this is the aortic valve or the aortic semilunar valve. We can also see here the chordae tendineae. Remember, these are the string-like structures that are reinforcing the valves, helping to open and close them. And then we can also see the papillary muscles here. Again, these are muscles on the inside of the heart. Ventricles themselves. The chordae tendineae are attached to the valves on one end, and then on the other end they're attached to the papillary muscles. When those muscles contract and relax, that opens and shuts those valves. Again, you will be labeling internal and external parts of the heart on your interactive notebook that you'll be completing later. Another diagram showing you blood flow through the heart. Moving on then, we're going to look at the heartbeat. Remember, we've already looked at skeletal muscle contraction. We're going to compare skeletal muscle contraction to cardiac muscle contraction. It's similar to skeletal muscle, but different. Remember that the skeletal muscle has contraction and then relaxation, and that's it. The cardiac muscle contraction is a little bit different. It does still have a contraction phase. This is when basically the action potential is arriving in the cardiac muscle cells. Sodium ion channels are opening. Now, sodium ion channels are called fast channels because they open quickly and remain open only for a few seconds, or I should say a few milliseconds. So again, on a graph, the line is going to go up very steeply as these sodium ion channels, these fast channels, open very quickly. It causes tension to rise very quickly. This is something that's different from our skeletal muscle. Remember, skeletal muscle had contraction and then relaxation, and that was it. But with the heart muscle, cardiac muscle, we do have contraction, but then we don't go directly into relaxation. We have what we call a plateau. Basically, what happens during this plateau is that the sodium ion channels close and calcium ion channels open. These calcium ion channels are called slow channels because they open more slowly and they remain open for a longer period of time. So this plateau is a major difference between skeletal and cardiac muscle contraction. After the plateau, then we do have the relaxation just like we had in cardiac muscle. The calcium ion channels begin to close and slow potassium ion channels open. These again are slow. They take longer to open. They stay open a little bit longer, and these restore the resting potential in the cardiac muscle cell. So as you can see here, we have the contraction, then we have a plateau, and then we have the relaxation. Again, the contraction is caused by the opening of the sodium ion channels. The plateau is caused by the opening of the calcium ion channels. And then the relaxation is caused by the opening of the potassium ion channels. Okay, so we've talked about one difference between skeletal and cardiac muscle, and that is the presence of a plateau due to these slow calcium ion channels. There's one more difference we need to talk about, and that is the absolute refractory period. After the action potential begins, so immediately after contraction, there is an absolute refractory period. During this period, the cardiac muscle cell membrane cannot respond at all to sodium ions. This prevents the formation of tetanic contractions. Basically, if you remember, tetanic contractions were a state of sustained contraction with no relaxation. Okay, you do not want that in cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle must contract, but then it must relax in order for the heart to be able to fill up with blood again. Okay, basically what happens is the atria contract, the ventricles contract, and then everything relaxes. You must have relaxation. In skeletal muscle, we want to get rid of that relaxation so that we can build up the most tension in that muscle cell and get lots of tension for strength, for moving things. But for cardiac muscle, we need relaxation. We need that heart muscle to relax so that heart can fill up with blood again. So we do not want to eliminate contraction. So therefore, we have this absolute refractory period. It is a period during which the cardiac muscle cell cannot respond to sodium ions at all. So basically, this allows us to get that contraction to get that relaxation before doing another contraction. It allows for complete relaxation before the next contraction occurs. And this is our second major difference between cardiac and skeletal muscle cell contraction. So again, adding to our diagram, the absolute refractory period, it begins right after those sodium ion channels have opened and we get contraction, and it lasts pretty much till almost the end of relaxation. Again, this ensures that we get complete relaxation of the cardiac muscle before we get another contraction. Each heartbeat is called a cardiac cycle. Again, as I said earlier, the two atria contract together, the two ventricles contract together, and then the whole heart relaxes. To refer to the contraction of the heart, this is called systole, and then relaxation of the heart is called diastole. Our heart sounds are called lubed up, and the sounds that you hear when you listen to someone's heartbeat, it's not the heart pumping that you're hearing. It's not the blood flowing that you're hearing. What you're hearing are the closing of the valves. The first part, the lub, is due to the closing of the right and left AV valves. That's your bicuspid and tricuspid. And then the dup, the second part of the heartbeat that you hear, is caused by the closing of the semilunar valves. So you've heard someone's heartbeat, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. There's two bumps, bump, 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 bump. The first bump is the closing of the AV valves, and then the second bump is the closing of the semilunar valves. Now, again, we talked about systole and diastole. You've probably heard something similar to this before, systolic and diastolic. Okay, so we're looking at blood pressure. Systole is contraction of the heart chambers. Diastole is relaxation of the heart chambers. So whenever your heart pumps out blood, it's pumping this blood out under pressure. Blood pressure is the greatest in the aorta. Again, that should be expected because remember that the aorta is connected to the left ventricle, which is the largest, strongest, and thickest part of the heart. So therefore, you expect the blood pressure to be very high in the aorta because it's receiving blood from that very large, strong chamber of the heart. The top number of our blood pressure is called the systolic pressure, and it occurs during ventricular systole, which is the contraction of the ventricles. And then the bottom number is called the diastolic, and it occurs during ventricular diastole, which is relaxation of the ventricles. And basically, that systolic and diastolic is the highest blood pressure in your circulatory system and the lowest blood pressure in your circulatory system. And I hope it makes sense to you that you're going to get your highest blood pressure from the contraction of the strongest parts of the heart, and you're going to get your lowest blood pressure from the relaxation of the strongest parts of the heart. Our heart can be affected by our nervous system, but it is not controlled by our nervous system. This fact that our heart is not controlled by our nervous system is called automaticity or autorhythmicity. Your heart has its own conducting system, its own electrical conducting system. So your heart controls itself. That is called automaticity or autorhythmicity. Now, there are different parts to this conducting system, but the main one that I want you to be familiar with is the natural cardiac pacemaker, which is the sinoatrial node or the SA node. It is called the natural cardiac pacemaker because it initiates the heartbeat. It basically sends a little electrical shock through your heart, through this conducting system of your heart, on average of every 0.85 seconds. Now, again, some people, when they get older, or for whatever reason, maybe their sinoatrial node, their natural cardiac pacemaker, isn't working well, and so therefore they end up having to have an artificial pacemaker put in. And basically what that is, you have a little pack with a little battery that's inserted right under the skin, kind of near the collarbone, and then a wire from that little battery pack is run down into the sinoatrial node. I think it's in your right atrium. And that little battery sends a little electric shock to that sinoatrial node every so often. And then that stimulates that sinoatrial node to send a little shock throughout the conducting system of the heart to establish a good heartbeat. Again, every so often, the batteries in that little battery pack of that artificial pacemaker have to be replaced. So they actually have to kind of make an incision and go in there and take the old batteries out and put a new battery in if the person lives that long. I'm a little bit familiar with this because my father-in-law, his heart, he was feeling really sluggish, and they determined his heart was only beating about 40 times per second, which is really, really slow. It's a really low heartbeat. And so they had to put in an artificial pacemaker, and that would send that little electrical shock along that wire into that sinoatrial node. And after they put that in, his heartbeat was about 60 beats per minute, which was a lot better than 40 beats per minute. Other parts of the conducting system, the atrioventricular node, as well as the atrioventricular bundle and Purkinje fibers. The main thing I'm going to ask you about, though, is this sinoatrial node. Don't worry about the others. But this diagram kind of shows you, here is the sinoatrial node in the right atrium. It initiates the heartbeat. It sends a little electrical shock throughout the rest of this conducting system in yellow that gets the heart to beat the way it's supposed to. We also have some extrinsic I don't really want to say control of the heartbeat, but effect of the heartbeat on the heartbeat. You have a cardiac control center in your medulla oblongata that can affect your heart rate by either causing it to speed up or slow down depending upon the conditions that you're under at the time. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the nervous system, but your parasympathetic branch of your nervous system actually is going to cause the heart rate to slow. The sympathetic branch of your nervous system is actually going to cause the heartbeat to speed up, like when you're in that fight or flight mode. And then there are some hormones that are released by the neurons that are causing this slowing or increasing of the heart rate. And some of those hormones that are involved are epinephrine, norepinephrine, as well as acetylcholine. Okay, now we want to look at an EKG or an electrocardiogram. An electrocardiogram or EKG or ECG is basically just a recording of the electrical changes that are occurring in your heart muscle, which is your myocardium, during a cardiac cycle. We have 3 parts to this EKG. We'll look at those in just a second, but we have a P wave, a QRS wave, and a T wave. The P wave is caused by contraction of the atria. We call that atrial depolarization. The QRS wave is caused by contraction of the ventricles. We call that ventricular depolarization. And then the T wave is caused by relaxation of the ventricles. We call that ventricular repolarization. Again, I remember repolarization, relaxation, repolarization, relaxation. Again, the P wave is going to be pretty small because that is contraction of those small parts of the heart, the atria. The T wave is going to be pretty small because that is going to be relaxation of the ventricles. But you can expect this QRS wave is going to be really large because it is the contraction of the largest, strongest parts of the heart. So it's going to be a really big wave, as we can see here. So here's our little P wave. Again, that is atrial depolarization or contraction. Here is our QRS wave. Look how big it is. That is ventricular contraction or depolarization of the ventricles. And then here is our T wave, relaxation of the ventricles or ventricular repolarization. Okay, looking at circulation of blood to the heart. Now, not only does the heart send out blood to all the parts of our body, but the heart itself needs a blood supply to provide it with oxygen and nutrients to keep it alive. Okay, so all the blood that's being pumped by the heart is not giving the heart any oxygen and nutrients. That's just the heart doing its job. The heart has its own circulation, its own blood vessels that lead to the heart to carry oxygen and nutrients, that life-giving supply of oxygen and nutrients to the heart. And this is called the coronary circulation. It's the coronary arteries that supply much needed oxygenated blood containing nutrients to the heart. Again, now remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart. But these coronary arteries are carrying blood away from the heart circulation toward the heart as an organ. Okay, so they are still carrying blood away from the heart circulation. And then you have different coronary arteries that supply different parts of the heart. I'm not going to ask you about those. But basically, your right coronary arteries are going to be supplying blood more to the right atrium and the ventricles. The left coronary arteries are going to be supplying blood more to the left atrium and the left ventricle. Again, the coronary arteries, guys, are pretty small. And so when you have a clogged artery that causes a heart attack, this is where the clog is happening, because these are the vessels that deliver the oxygenated blood to the heart. If a clog happens, blood flow can't get to the heart like it should. The heart does without oxygen. The heart is damaged. That is what a heart attack is. So again, here you can see some of your coronary arteries. Here, this is the right coronary artery. Here you have the left coronary artery. Arteriosclerosis, what is that? It is a buildup of fatty material that we call plaque, which mainly contains cholesterol, in the lining of your arteries. This can lead to a thrombus, which is a blood clot. This thrombus can dislodge, it can break free and flow throughout your blood vessels. When it does this, it's called an embolus. When this embolus blocks a vessel in your brain or your heart, this leads to heart attack and stroke, and this is called thromboembolism. Another name for a stroke is a cerebrovascular accident, and this happens when an embolus becomes lodged in a small blood vessel in your brain, and this causes a part of the brain to do without oxygen, and so it becomes damaged. That's what a stroke is. a heart attack is the very same thing. The only difference is instead of having an embolus that is clogging a vessel in the brain, we have an embolus that is clogging one of those coronary arteries and preventing blood flow and therefore oxygen supply to the heart, which damages the heart. Again, that's what a heart attack is. Another name for a heart attack is a myocardial infarction, also called an MI, or an acute myocardial infarction, or an AMI. If you have partial blockage of one of those coronary arteries, it can cause chest pain, which is called angina pectoris. This can also lead to aneurysm. Basically, you can actually have a clog that ends up causing a buildup of blood behind it, and that can cause the ballooning of a vessel in your brain. If that pops, then that's called an aneurysm, and it can lead to bleeding and death. You can also even have aneurysms in other vessels as well. You can have an aortic aneurysm. Basically, this is where, you guys, we all have weak spots in our blood vessels. Genetically, we have weak spots in our blood vessels. Some people have more or worse weak spots than others. If your blood pressure becomes too high in your blood vessels, this can lead to the weak spots in some of your blood vessels bulging out like a balloon, ballooning out. And then if they pop, if that aneurysm, if that ballooning pops, then it leads to bleeding and death. An aortic aneurysm is very fatal very quickly, within just a few minutes, because, again, your aorta is the largest artery in your body. If it becomes damaged or it has an aneurysm, a ballooning that pops, then blood is just going to gush out of there, and you're going to bleed to death very quickly. Bleeding on the brain from an aneurysm can have similar results. It just may take a little bit longer sometimes, depending on where it happens. So if the aneurysm is in a large vessel and the vessel bursts, then bleeding and death can result. Over time, we all have weak spots in our vessels, but over time, arteriosclerosis, that buildup of that fatty material in your vessels, as well as high blood pressure, can lead to the ballooning of those weak spots. It can actually lead to even more weak spots in your blood vessels. So it's very important that you eat right, exercise, take care of yourself to help limit the damage to your blood vessels and the risk of stroke and heart attack, as well as aneurysm. And you guys, high blood pressure is an indicator for stroke and heart attack, because high blood pressure, whether it's genetic or whether it's due to a buildup of fatty material in your vessels, is an indicator that you have narrowed vessels. Again, when this plaque builds up in your vessels, it causes the opening to become more and more narrow. And the more narrow it is, the more easily an embolus is going to be able to form and then get into a small vessel and block off the blood flow into that vessel. So, hypertension, high blood pressure is definitely associated with higher risk of stroke and heart attack, as well as aneurysm. So how does a coronary bypass work? Well, basically what they do, if you have a clog here in this coronary artery, they're going to graft arteries, let's say from your lower legs. They're going to attach it to the aorta and then attach it. It's just like a bypass on an interstate. You don't want to go through this big city of Atlanta and all the traffic. Then you're going to get off on a bypass to bypass the city of Atlanta and go around Atlanta to get to where you're going. So it's the same thing here. If this is Atlanta, this is where the clog is, so we're not getting blood down here like we should to this part of the heart. Then we're going to take a blood vessel from the lower leg. We're going to attach it on one end to the aorta. Remember, this is oxygenated blood coming out of the left ventricle. And we are going to attach it down here below the clog so that blood can go directly from the aorta and still get down here below this clog. Same thing here. Here you can see this person has a triple bypass. So here's a clog, here's a clog, here's a clog. So they've taken 3 vessels from the legs, attached them to the aorta, and then attached them below the clog so that you can bypass the clog and blood can still get to where it needs to go to this heart muscle. Another thing that they can do is they can actually do gene therapy. They can actually inject. They have a medicine that they can inject and actually cause the heart to grow its own bypasses, to grow vessels out from this. If given enough time, that can happen. But again, sometimes you don't have time to wait for that. Sometimes you're having a heart attack right now and you've got to get blood to this heart muscle right now. And so they're going to do a bypass rather than that gene therapy. Another thing that they do, if the vessel is not completely clogged, if you're a candidate, they're going to do what we call the balloon surgery or an angioplasty. And basically, what they're going to do there is they are going, here's the clog, okay? We can see that it's not completely blocked, but again, it wouldn't take much for an embolus, a clot, to come through here and block this off. So we're probably having some angina pectoris. We're having some chest pain right here. So what they're going to do is they're going to take this little rod with this balloon on the end of it, and they're going to stick it through there, and they're going to inflate that balloon. And when they inflate that balloon, you can see how it kind of pushes this opening. See how narrow this is, and look how open it is now. So that it pushes. They're not getting rid of the clog. This is the plaque, the fatty material built up on the vessel. They're not getting rid of that. You can't. If you were to try to get rid of that and break that off, that would end up causing an embolus, and it would go somewhere else in the body and clog up another vessel, and you would end up with a heart attack or stroke or something else. So what they're doing here is they're just kind of putting that balloon in there and inflating it and opening up that opening. Now, once they take this balloon out, it's not going to take long for this to collapse back in just like this again. So what they're going to do is they're going to put a stent in here. A stent is a structure that's going to kind of push against this fatty material and kind of hold that vessel open, making it a bigger opening for the blood to come through so that our blood flow is not being limited, and also making it harder for a clot to form or for a clot to get in here and clog this up. You can see how blood flow is really restricted here, and it's not going to take much for an embolus to come through here and clog this up. But when we push this open and then they insert a stent to hold it open, then that's going to make that opening a lot bigger. It's going to make the blood flow less restricted, and it's also going to prevent it from collapsing back in, and it's going to make an embolus less likely to be able to clog that vessel up. What they're also going to do on this is they're going to put a medication called heparin, as I have here, heparin. It just helps to prevent blood clotting. Anytime you have surgery, there's a risk of blood clots. In addition to using heparin to prevent blood clots, they also have a medication. If someone comes into the ER and they're having a heart attack, they can actually give them an injection of this TPA, this tissue plasminogen activator, that converts plasminogen into an enzyme that dissolves blood clots. It can lead to bleeding, but if you're having a heart attack, a major heart attack, then they can give you that injection in the ER, and that can help to dissolve a blood clot to kind of get rid of that embolus, to break up that embolus, so that to stop it from restricting the blood flow to the heart. Also, people who are at risk of heart attack and stroke, they have high blood pressure, they have plaque buildup in their vessels, they are usually put on an aspirin regimen where they take like a baby aspirin every day. Aspirin helps to thin the blood. It helps to reduce the stickiness of the platelets and reduce the formation of clots, which lowers the risk of heart attack and stroke. Heart transplants can be done if there's a donor, but again, anytime someone has to have a heart transplant, they must be on immunosuppressive drugs to keep their body from rejecting that organ, because that organ is not their organ and their body knows that. Again, hypertension is high blood pressure. About 20% of Americans suffer from hypertension. If your systolic pressure is 140 or greater, or your diastolic is 90 or greater, then you have high blood pressure. And again, that is considered a risk factor for strokes and heart attacks, because not only does it weaken the blood vessels, causing those weaker spots that can end up in aneurysm, but it also indicates that your blood vessels are more narrow. And again, anytime a vessel is more narrow, think of a straw. You have a smaller straw, a larger straw. The more narrow an opening is, the more pressure it's going to take to get that blood through that narrow opening. So if you have high blood pressure, that means that your vessels are probably narrowed, which indicates a buildup of plaque, of that fatty material on your vessels, which is what ends up causing an embolus and causing heart attacks and strokes. There's some people, like I think my husband's side of the family has a genetic predisposition for high blood pressure, and this is because his mother was probably like 39 when she started taking high blood pressure medication. My husband was like 37 when he started taking high blood pressure medication. Basically, genetically, I think they are predisposed to having high blood pressure because they have a gene that codes for the production of this chemical called angiotensinogen. Angiotensinogen is a vasoconstrictor. It causes the blood vessels to constrict. And again, if blood vessels constrict, they get smaller. So anyone who has high blood pressure, for whatever reason, has more narrow vessels, whether it is genetic because they're producing this angiotensinogen, or whether it is because you have a buildup of plaque, fatty material in your vessels. High blood pressure indicates narrowed vessels, which indicates an increased likelihood that an embolus could form and clog up those narrowed vessels. Okay, so you are going to do, after watching this, you're going to do your Google form and you're going to do your Heart interactive notebook. Please let me know if you have any questions. Hope you have a great day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.